What would you do if the only sanctuary you had, the walls meant to protect your soul, became the very place of your torment? It began on a cold dawn in the spring of 1453. The bells of Constantinople rang out across the ancient city one final time. The sound carried through narrow stone streets and echoed through the marble corridors of a convent perched on a hill overlooking the Golden Horn. Inside, dozens of Christian nuns huddled in silence, their trembling hands clutching wooden rosaries as the thunder of war grew closer. The sky itself seemed to bleed that morning, streaked with the crimson light of fire and smoke. Outside the walls, the Ottoman cannons had been roaring for weeks, shaking the earth, splintering centuries-old stone. But this morning, the thunder was different. It wasn't distant anymore, it was moving closer. Mother Helena, the abbess, had seen wars before, but never like this. She could feel something deeper in the air, a sense of finality, as though an entire world was about to collapse. She whispered prayers over each of her sisters, pressing their foreheads with the sign of the cross, telling them that God would protect them. Yet even as she spoke, her eyes flicked toward the door, toward the faint tremor of footsteps echoing beyond the convent's outer gate. The city's great defenders, led by Emperor Constantine XI, were falling. The walls that had guarded Christendom for 1,000 years were crumbling. The Ottomans were no longer at the gates, they were inside. When the first screams reached the convent, they didn't come from the streets but from the nearby monastery. The sound of crashing wood, the metallic ring of swords, and then silence. Helena gathered her nuns in the chapel. Candles flickered in the dark, their wax melting faster than usual, as though time itself was being burned away. They began to sing hymns, their voices trembling but defiant, a final offering to the God they believed would never abandon them. But faith can feel very small when faced with the roar of conquest. The heavy doors burst open. Dust and sunlight poured in. The figures that entered were not men of mercy. They wore armor darkened with soot and blood, their curved scimitars glinting with the reflection of fire from the city beyond. Ottoman soldiers, victorious, furious, and hungry for domination, had come not only for the city's gold, but for its souls. They had been promised that the city would be theirs. Everything in it! Mother Helena stepped forward, clutching her cross, her voice trembling but firm. "This is the house of God," she said. "You will find nothing of value here." The leader of the raiding group, a tall man with piercing eyes and a blood-stained turban, smiled faintly. "Everything of value is here," he replied, his gaze moving slowly over the terrified faces of the women before him. What followed was not war, it was desecration. The convent, once a place of silence and prayer, became a chamber of screams. The soldiers tore through the sacred halls, dragging nuns from their hiding places, ripping icons from the walls, and defiling everything that had once been holy. The marble floors that had felt the soft tread of sandals now echoed with boots and the sharp clatter of steel. Some nuns resisted. They clung to their faith, to their vows of purity and devotion, even as the conquerors mocked them for it. But resistance meant nothing in the face of cruelty. Many were taken, their fate sealed within those walls that had once promised protection. Helena was struck down trying to protect the youngest of her sisters, a girl, barely 16, named Maria. When she fell, clutching her cross, the soldiers laughed, calling her faith a weapon that could not kill. Outside, the city was burning. Churches were looted, altars shattered, relics stolen and paraded through the streets as trophies. The Hagia Sophia, the jewel of Christendom, had fallen silent under Ottoman chants. Inside its vast dome, crosses were torn down, replaced by crescents. The few who had taken refuge within its walls were dragged out, their screams echoing beneath the soaring mosaics that once depicted angels and saints. For the nuns who survived, captivity awaited. Many were marched through the streets like spoils of war, stripped of their habits, their dignity, their identity. Some were sold in the slave markets that sprang up in the heart of the conquered city. Others were taken as prizes by soldiers, forced into lives of servitude or their vows shattered in the shadow of empire. Maria, the young nun who had clung to Helena's robes until the very end, was among them. She was taken by a commander named Demir, a man who claimed to be merciful compared to others. He brought her to his quarters, fed her, and told her she should be grateful for being spared. But mercy is a word that loses its meaning when it comes from the lips of the conqueror. He demanded she renounce her faith, bow to Allah, and forget the name of Christ. Each time she refused, he smiled and took something more from her soul. Days turned to weeks, and the convent was transformed into an Ottoman garrison. The wall still stood, but their silence was no longer sacred, it was haunted. Every night, Maria would hear the muffled cries of others who had once prayed beside her, echoes of broken vows and shattered faith. She began to carve a small cross into the wooden beam beside her bed, one line each night, as if trying to remind herself that she still existed. Outside, the empire celebrated its victory. Sultan Mehmed II declared the city the new capital of the world, renaming it Istanbul. To him, this conquest was divine, will the triumph of Islam over a decaying Christendom. But within the cracks of his empire's glory, the whispers of the fallen still lingered. Rumors began to spread. Some said the ghosts of the nuns roamed the ruined convent, their chants echoing through the night air, mingling with the call to prayer. Others spoke of a curse that every man who had taken part in the desecration would meet an unnatural death. And though superstition was common in those days, what happened next gave those whispers a terrible weight. Within months, the soldiers who had raided the convent began dying in strange, violent ways. One was found drowned in a shallow well. Another burned alive in his sleep when his tent caught fire. Demir, the commander, who had taken Maria, was found one morning with his throat slit from ear to ear, his blood pooled beneath the same beam where Maria had carved her cross. No one knew who had done it. Some said it was vengeance from the surviving Christians. Others believed it was divine justice. But a few those who had seen Maria last swore they had heard her voice in the dark the night before he died, singing a hymn that had been forbidden since the city fell. After that, she was never seen again. Years later, travelers who passed through the city would speak of a strange ruin on the hill, a place where no one dared to enter after sunset. The locals said the air grew cold near its gates, that the faint sound of chanting could still be heard, rising and falling like the breath of the dead. Some claimed that if you listened closely, you could still hear a woman's voice whispering in Greek a single word repeated over and over: forgive. But forgiveness was not something easily found in the wake of empire. The Ottomans would continue to expand their reach for centuries, and the memory of what they did to the women of Constantinople would fade into silence, buried beneath the glory of conquest and the rewriting of history. Yet beneath those stones, beneath the grand mosques that rose over shattered churches, the story of the nuns endured in whispers. And somewhere hidden deep, within the ruins, an old wooden beam still stands, marked with a tiny cross carved by a trembling hand. What no one could ever explain was why, even after all those years, the wood beneath that cross remained damp, as if someone had been crying there, even long after the world had forgotten her name. But that was only the beginning of the horrors that would unfold as the empire grew. Because what happened in Constantinople was not an isolated tragedy, it was the first shadow of something much darker that spread across Europe in the years to come. The ghosts of empires do not rest. They shift beneath the cobblestones, hidden under centuries of dust and denial. And though the Ottoman Empire moved on razing cities, building monuments, and writing its victories in gold, the forgotten voices beneath those stones whispered still. By the mid-1500s, Istanbul was the center of the world. Its skylines shimmered with domes and minarets. Its bazaars buzzed with languages from every corner of the empire. The Sultan's court brimmed with scholars, poets, and architects. Yet among the grandeur, something dark lingered in the city's memory. There were places people refused to build upon, streets that merchants avoided at dusk, and names erased from records without explanation. The hill where the convent once stood was one of them. It had become overgrown, wild with ivy and cypress trees. Locals called it the Hill of the Veiled Ones. Children dared each other to climb it, but few ever did. They said at night, you could hear bells soft and uneven, like a prayer trying to escape the grave. In 1562, a fire swept through the nearby district, devouring homes and warehouses. When the smoke cleared, the flames had spared only one Arietta hill. The fire had stopped at its base, as if some unseen boundary had held it back. That alone drew attention from the Sultan's architects and mystics. Among them was Sinan, the empire's greatest builder. He believed in symmetry, balance, and divine geometry. He saw the untouched hill not as a curse, but as a mysterious place that resisted destruction. The Sultan ordered Sinan to survey the area to determine if it could host a new mosque complex. A symbol of renewal, he said. Sinan obeyed, but as he ascended the hill, he felt something heavy in the air. The silence wasn't peace, it was watchfulness. His men began clearing the brush. Beneath layers of soil, they unearthed fragments of carved stone, broken crosses, and rusted candle holders. Then, at the center of the hill, their shovels struck wood. Sinan knelt, brushing away the dirt. What he found made his breath catch the same beam, blackened and worn, but impossibly preserved. The carved cross was still visible, smoothened by time, yet defiant against decay. Sinan was not a superstitious man. But when he touched the wood, a sudden cold spread through his hand and into his chest. For a moment, he felt something that words could not contain, a sorrow so deep it seemed older than the empire itself. He pulled back quickly and ordered the men to stop digging. That night, he couldn't sleep. The scent of smoke and incense haunted him. And in the stillness of his chamber, he thought he heard faint singing women's voices, rising and falling like waves. The next morning, Sinan visited the Sultan. He told him the soil was unstable, unfit for construction. The Sultan accepted his judgment without question. The hill was left untouched. Once again, a blank space in the map of the city. But Sinan couldn't let it go. In the privacy of his journals, he wrote of a strange dream that followed him for weeks. In it, he stood within the ruins of a chapel, the walls dripping with candle wax and tears. A young woman approached him, her face half hidden by a veil. She spoke a language he didn't understand, but her eyes, dark and burning, conveyed one word that echoed in his mind, even after waking: witness. He began sketching architectural designs he couldn't explain, arcades shaped like crosses hidden within crescents, windows arranged to cast the shadow of a tear at noon. The fusion of Christian and Islamic forms would later define his work. Praised by scholars as genius, yet none knew the truth. He was haunted by a voice from a forgotten past. As centuries passed, the empire changed hands, dynasties rose and fell, and the story of the nuns became a whisper fading into myth. But some records endured, buried deep in church archives and private collections. Letters written in Latin, Greek, and Ottoman Turkish described visions, dreams, and unexplained deaths tied to the hill. One manuscript, penned by an Armenian priest in the 1700s, told of a young novice who claimed to have met a woman clothed in light near the ruins. She said the woman's hands were bleeding, but she smiled and told her, "There are wounds the earth will never heal." The priest dismissed it as delirium until the novice disappeared. 2 centuries later, when the Ottoman Empire began to crumble in the early 1900s, the past clawed its way to the surface once more. Istanbul was restless, caught between faith and revolution, glory and decay. Archaeologists from Europe flooded the city, eager to uncover relics of Byzantium. One of them, a French historian named Claire Dufresne, stumbled upon the legend of the convent while studying the siege chronicles. Her notes describe a peculiar obsession. She believed the key to understanding the fall of Constantinople lay not in the walls of the city, but in what happened after it. The silence that followed. Claire managed to locate the hill through old Ottoman maps. Locals warned her to stay away. "That place remembers," one old man told her. "It doesn't like to be disturbed." She laughed, thinking it's superstition. But on her first night of excavation, as her team dug through the outer soil, a thick fog descended. The air turned heavy with the smell of damp wood and salt, though the sea was miles away. Then one of her workers screamed. They had uncovered bones human. Small, delicate. Dozens of them. Some still bore the faint traces of cloth, rosary beads tangled in their grasp. Claire knelt beside the remains, brushing the dirt from a skull that seemed to stare back at her. Her lantern flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move even when she stood still. And then she saw the beam. Still there, still wet to the touch. When she pressed her hand against it, she swore she heard a heartbeat not hers, but something slow, distant, alive. That night, Claire wrote in her journal, "I no longer believe this is merely history. This is something the earth itself remembers, something the empire tried to bury. The next morning, her tent was found empty, her notes scattered. Only her journal remained, half-burned, the ink smeared by what looked like tears. Her final line was barely legible. She is still here. The excavation was abandoned. The hill was fenced off, declared unsafe. Yet people continued to report strange things, lamps flickering near the ruins, voices echoing after midnight. A guard once claimed he saw a woman walking through the fog, her robe torn, her face glowing faintly like the embers of dying candles. When he approached, she looked at him and whispered, "You shouldn't be here." He left his post that same night and never returned. And so, the story of the convent remained half-truth, half-legend, its horror diluted by time but never erased. Some said the nuns had become angels of vengeance, punishing desecration. Others said they were simply souls trapped between forgiveness and fury, unable to rest. But those who'd been close enough to the hill, even in modern times, describe something far simpler and far more human. A feeling. The sensation of standing in a place that remembers pain too deep to fade. When the Ottoman Empire finally fell, the new republic rose in its place, eager to cut ties with the ghosts of its past. Cemeteries were moved, churches demolished or turned to museums. Yet the hill was left alone, deliberately unmarked. Officials claimed it had new cultural significance, but for those who walked near it, the silence said otherwise. In 1924, a Turkish journalist named Ahmet Kaya attempted to write a story exposing the He interviewed old residents, gathered testimonies, and even tracked down a family who claimed descent from one of the original Ottoman soldiers said to have taken part in the attack. An elderly woman in that family, nearly blind, told him, "We carry their curse. Every firstborn son in our line dies before his 30th year." Ahmet dismissed it as myth, but when he returned home that night, his son, just 20, had collapsed from sudden heart failure. Ahmet never published his story. By the 1950s, the hill had been quietly converted into a park. Children played over the buried stones. Lovers carved their initials into the trees. And yet, every few years, there were reports of sudden chills, of photographs that developed with blurred figures in the background, of women's voices humming faintly through the wind. Today, the site is nearly forgotten. Tourists pass it without a glance. A handful of historians still whisper about the Weeping Hill, and a few of the city's elders refuse to walk near it after dark. But if you ask them why, they'll say only this: because some wounds do not belong to history, they belong to the earth. And on nights when the moon is high and the city quiets, the faint sound of chanting still drifts across the hill. Some hear it as mourning, others as prayer. But those who listen closely say it's something else entirely, a call, rising from the soil, reaching out to anyone willing to remember what the world has tried so hard to forget. What the Ottomans did to those women was not simply destruction, it was an erasure, but even erasure leaves trace. And the more the world builds over them, the louder the earth seems to whisper their names. Because in the end, memory always finds its way back to the surface, and what waits beneath that hill has not yet been forgiven. The wind howled across the fjord as Harold's fleet cut through the steel-gray water, each ship moving in perfect formation like wolves on a hunt. The morning mist clung low, curling around the carved dragon heads at the prow of each longship, their eyes seeming to glimmer with life. Behind them, the mountains stood silent ancient witnesses to the man who dared to call himself the last Viking king. Harold stood near the bow, his fur-lined cloak snapping against the cold wind, his gaze fixed on the horizon where land met the unknown. He could feel its fate moving beneath the waves, drawing him closer to a reckoning long promised by the gods themselves. The air carried the scent of salt and iron, the rhythm of oars pounding in unison, echoing like the heartbeat of an empire. His men were hardened, warriors each one bearing scars that spoke of past battles and unburied ghosts. Yet, beneath their fierce exteriors lay something unspoken: doubt. The kind that grows in the shadows between glory and ruin. Rumors had spread through the ranks of betrayal, of omens seen in the night sky, of a raven that had followed their fleet since they left Norway's shores. Harold dismissed them at first, but now, with each passing mile, he couldn't ignore the chill crawling up his spine. He had conquered kingdoms, burned cities, and written his name into the sagas of men. Yet something within him had begun to shift. It wasn't fear, no. Harold Hardrada feared nothing mortal. It was the whisper of destiny, that quiet, haunting voice that reminds even the greatest warriors that their time beneath the sun is brief. The gods, he knew, demanded balance. Every crown taken had its cost, every victory its shadow. As the ships neared the English coast, the sea grew restless. Waves rose like walls, crashing against the sides of the long ships, threatening to swallow them whole. The sky darkened to an iron hue, and lightning tore through the clouds with a sound like the roar of ancient beasts. Harold's men prayed to Thor and Odin, gripping their shields tight as rain lashed their faces. Harold himself stood unmoving, staring into the chaos with a calm that unnerved even his closest captains. The storm is not our enemy, he shouted over the thunder, and it is the test before the triumph. By the time the fleet reached land, half the men were drenched, exhausted, yet alive. They pulled the ships ashore and made camp near a river's edge. Fires flickered under the rain's dying breath, and the men gathered around them, some sharpening blades, others whispering to the night. Harold sat alone on a fallen log, staring into the fire. The flames danced in his eyes, and for a fleeting moment, he saw the faces of those he had lost: his brother Olaf, fallen kings, forgotten friends. Each ghost looked back at him, wordless, their expressions caught between pride and sorrow. He turned his gaze to the stars, now breaking through the clouds. Is this what it means to be remembered? He muttered to the heavens. To walk alone while your name burns brighter than your soul! The crackling fire gave no answer, only the distant call of an owl, and the murmur of the river filled the silence. That night, a shadow crept into the campus scout, returning with strange news. My king, he said, bowing low. The Saxons? No, we're here. They march under a new banner, led by Harold Godwinson. The name struck something within Harold. A man who once called him ally, now enemy. Two heralds, two kings, bound by fate to clash under the same storm-torn sky. The gods had a cruel sense of poetry. The following days unfolded like the tightening of a noose. Skirmishes erupted in the forest, fleeting, bloody encounters that tested both sides. Harold's forces won each battle with savage precision, but the cost grew heavier. Men whispered that the English fought not like soldiers, but like cornered beasts. Each victory felt hollow, each step closer to York, a step deeper into something unseen. Then came the night of the dream. Harold awoke to find himself standing on a battlefield washed in crimson light. Ravens circled overhead, their cries echoing through the mist. A woman stood before him, her cloak woven from stars, her face both beautiful and terrible. You chased the crown of a world already fading, she said. And what will you trade for it? The song of your people, the fire of your name. Her voice was neither cruel nor kind, merely inevitable. Harold reached for his sword, but his hand passed through her like smoke. The age of the axe and shield ends with you, she whispered. After you! Silence! He woke, drenched in sweat, the echoes of her words gnawing at his mind. Dawn came, and with it, the decision to march on Stamford Bridge. His commanders gathered, voices sharp, eyes wary. Some urged caution, others thirsted for glory. Harold's gaze cut through them like a blade. We did not cross seas and storms to wait behind walls, he declared. We are the storm. The march was swift and merciless. Fields of wildflowers bowed beneath their boots, and villages emptied before their approach. Yet something in the air felt wrong too, still, too quiet. When they reached the bridge, the horizon glimmered with armor and banners. The Saxon army had arrived faster than any had believed possible. For the first time in years, Harold felt the faint stir of uncertainty. The battle erupted like thunder. Arrows darkened the sky, shields clashed, and the air filled with the metallic temps of blood and smoke. Harold fought at the front, his sword carving through the chaos, his voice carrying above the din of war cry born from centuries of conquest. He moved like a force of nature, his armor streaked with crimson, his eyes burning with purpose. But amid the roar, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A Saxon warrior, massive and silent, wielding a great axe, cutting through his men as if guided by fate itself. Their eyes met across the bridge, a moment stretched thin between life and legend. The warrior raised his axe, and Harold felt that strange calm again. Every heartbeat, every choice, every crown it, all led to this. He lunged forward, sword gleaming, meeting the Saxon's strike with a clash that sent sparks flying into the mist. The world seemed to hold its breath. The sound of steel meeting flesh followed. Blood hit the stones, warm and final. Harold fell to one knee, his vision blurring, the roar of battle fading to a distant hum. Around him, his men screamed his name, their cries torn by wind and fire. The Saxons stepped back, watching as the last Viking king struggled to stand. Harold's fingers brushed the hilt of his sword, but strength had left him. The world tilted, the sky a whirl of gray and red. And then silence. But even in that silence, something lingered. A whisper, soft but eternal. It wasn't the end. Not yet. As his body fell, his eyes caught the glint of sunlight breaking through the clouds, landing on the river below. In its reflection, he saw not his death, but his legacy ships on distant shores. Warriors telling his story. Children born under the echo of his name. As the world dimmed, Harold smiled faintly. The gods had taken his life, but not his fire. Somewhere beyond the mortal realm, the woman from his dream waited, her hand outstretched. "You kept your promise," she said. "You brought the storm." And with that, the last Viking closed his eyes, not in defeat, but in defiance. Because some kings die on the battlefield, but legends never truly fall. The river carried his reflection downstream, toward the waiting sea, where waves whispered of vengeance, and the wind began to stir once more as if even nature refused to let him rest. What came next would not be peace, but the beginning of something else entirely. The river carried Harold's body downstream like a secret the world wasn't ready to let go of. The water turned crimson for a moment, then faded to silver, swallowing the traces of war beneath its restless current. But the air around Stamford Bridge didn't settle. The cries of battle still echoed in the distance, fading into the hills, into the wind that now whispered the name of the fallen king. Harold Hardrada, the last Viking. The storm that had shaken empires was gone, but its thunder had not yet ceased. As dusk settled over the blood-soaked field, ravens descended from the darkening sky, silent and solemn. They perched upon broken shields and shattered helmets, watching the dying light bleed across the horizon. The survivors moved among the dead, their faces pale, their steps heavy. Some searched for friends, others searched for meaning. Every life taken seemed to leave a shadow that clung to the living. Far from the battlefield, near the edge of the forest, a lone figure moved with purpose. It was Eirik, one of Harold's most trusted captains, his armor cracked, his beard matted with blood and rain. His eyes burned not with tears, but with the unrelenting fire of disbelief. He had fought beside the king through countless battles. He had seen Harold rise when others fell, command when all seemed lost. But not this time. This time, fate had closed its fist. He found the king's sword half buried in the mud, its edge dulled but still gleaming faintly under the dying sun. Eirik knelt beside it, his fingers trembling as he brushed away the dirt. "You said no man could kill you," he whispered. "Perhaps no man did." He lifted the sword, its weight feeling heavier than before, as if it carried the burden of an entire age. Behind him, the remnants of the Norse camp stood in silence. Fires burned low, casting flickering shadows that stretched like ghosts across the ground. The men gathered around Eirik, their eyes hollow, their faces carved by exhaustion and grief. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Each of them felt the final unraveling of something greater than themselves. Night fell slowly, heavy and suffocating. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of ash and salt from the nearby sea. Eirik stood by the riverbank, watching the current twist and shimmer under the moonlight. He could almost see him there, the king, standing tall, staring down fate as if it were just another enemy to conquer. The thought made his chest tighten. He was not meant to die here, Eirik muttered. Not like this! But then came another voice, soft yet sharp. No warrior chooses his ending, Eirik. Only his legacy. It was Ingrid, a shield maiden who had followed Harold since his early campaigns. Her face bore the marks of battle, yet her eyes were steady, unwavering. She stepped beside him, looking at the river as if it could answer the questions neither of them dared to ask. He knew this was coming! You saw it too, didn't you? The way he looked before the storm broke. Eirik nodded slowly. He wasn't afraid. It was as if he already saw the end and accepted it. Then we must do the same, she said. The gods do not mourn kings. They remember them. Her words hung in the cold night air, sinking into the silence that followed. Yet beneath that silence, something began to stir. The men started to speak in hushed tones about omens, visions, and the raven that had circled above the fleet since they left Norway. Some swore they saw it still, gliding over the trees, its wings cutting through the moonlight like a blade. By morning, the English had taken the field. The dead were gathered. The wounded tended to. But the stories spread faster than any messenger could ride. They said the Norse king had fought like a god, that arrows broke against his armor, that he laughed even as he bled. They said when he fell, thunder rolled across the sky, though no storm remained. The Saxons, hardened by victory, buried him with honor, though none dared linger too long near the spot where he lay. But legends are never buried easily. In Norway, word of Harold's fall arrived like a wound that would not heal. The great halls that once echoed with laughter now trembled with silence. The skalds sang of his deeds, their voices breaking as they reached the end of his tale. Yet for every verse of glory, there was a whisper of unease. Some said Harold's death marked the end of the old ways, that the gods had turned their gaze from the north. Others claimed his spirit would not rest until his blood was avenged. Ingrid and Eirik returned home with what was left of the fleet. The journey back was slow, burdened by loss and the weight of unanswered prayers. Each night, they saw strange lights flickering above the sea, and each morning, the wind seemed to carry faint echoes of war cries that were no longer real. When they finally reached Norway's shores, they were greeted not with celebration, but with a hush that spread like frost through the villages. Eirik stood before the king's hall, its doors open but empty. He placed Harold's sword upon the great table where once maps and battle plans had been laid. The hall smelled of smoke and pine, the same scent that had marked the beginning of every campaign. But now it felt hollow, stripped of its soul. He built an empire of fire, Ingrid said quietly behind him. And now only embers remain. Eirik turned to her. Embers can still burn! She looked at him, then not with hope, but with the weary understanding of someone who had seen too many winters. Yes! But only if someone remembers how! That night, the wind rose again, rattling the wooden beams of the hall. Eirik sat before the fire, staring into the flames as if they could reveal the path ahead. The world was changing. He could feel it in the way the earth seemed to hum, restless and alive. The age of swords and sagas was fading, replaced by something quieter, colder. And yet, within that fading, there was defiance. The memory of a king who refused to kneel, even before death itself. He thought of Harold's last smile, a faint curve of pride, of peace. What if the king had known his death was not the end, but a beginning? What if his fall was the seed from which new legends would rise? The thought sent a shiver through Eirik's spine. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and slow, covering the ground like a shroud. Ingrid stood at the doorway, watching the flakes drift through the night. The gods are quiet, she said. Too quiet! Eirik rose, gripping the sword once more. Then perhaps it's our turn to speak. As he stepped outside, the snow crunched beneath his boots. The air was sharp, electric, as though the world itself was waiting for something to break. In the distance, the mountains loomed like sleeping giants, their peaks lost in mist. Eirik raised the sword to the sky, its blade catching the moonlight. Somewhere in the darkness, a raven cried. The sound cut through the silence, like a heartbeat, returning after too long a stillness. Ingrid turned sharply toward the sound, her breath catching in her throat. The bird swooped low, its wings black as the void, before vanishing into the white horizon. Eirik lowered the sword slowly, his eyes narrowing. "He's not gone," he said. Barely more than a whisper. "He's waiting." And in that moment, the wind shifted. It carried a new note, something colder, sharper, filled with the promise of reckoning. The snow fell harder, and the fire behind them flickered wildly, as if some unseen force had breathed life into it once more. Far across the sea, in the land that had taken the king's life, strange storms began to form again over the coast. Villagers spoke of thunder with no clouds, of lights moving across the water at night, and always the sound of wings. Something was coming. Something vast and unseen. The age of Harald Hardrada had ended, but the storm he unleashed was only gathering strength. And as the first crack of distant thunder rolled across the horizon, the world seemed to brace itself for what came next. The storm came without warning. A roar from the sea, so deep it seemed to rise from the bones of the earth itself. The fjord churned black and silver beneath the pale sky, and thunder cracked across the peaks like the voice of something ancient stirring from its slumber. Villages along the coast dropped what they held, staring out toward the horizon, where waves began to climb higher than ships had ever dared sail. Eirik stood on the cliff above the shore, his cloak whipping around him in the wind. The air tasted of salt and iron. Below, the surf crashed against the rocks with a fury that shook the ground beneath his feet. Ingrid joined him, her hair tangled by the storm, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "It's him," she said softly, barely audible through the wind. "The sea remembers." A shape appeared in the distance, dark, jagged, impossible. For a moment, it looked like the ribs of a ship rising from the depths. Then, lightning illuminated the waters, and Eirik saw it clearly. A longship, ancient and broken, drifting toward the shore without sails or crew. The carved dragon prow still stood, though its wood was splintered and blackened. Eirik's breath caught. He knew that ship. Everyone who had sailed under Harald Hardrada knew it. It was Ormen, the king's own warship, the Serpent of the Sea. Lost after Stamford Bridge, believed to have gone down with the last of his men. Yet here it was, crawling out of the storm like something torn from the underworld. As the ship struck the rocks, a sound like a cry tore through the wind, a sound not quite human. The waves hissed against the hull, and for a fleeting moment, Eirik thought he saw figures moving on the deck, shadows of warriors, faces pale and eyes hollow. Then the lightning vanished, and they were gone. Only the wreck remained. He and Ingrid descended the cliff, their steps cautious, the ground slick with rain and sea spray. The ship groaned as they approached, its planks creaking under the weight of years and memory. Eirik touched aside, his hand trembling. "He's here," he whispered. "I can feel it." Inside the wreck, the air was thick with a scent of salt and decay. Water dripped from the beams. In the center of the ship, half buried beneath seaweed and splintered wood, lay a chest bound in rusted iron. Eirik knelt, pressing his hand to the lid. It was cold, so cold, it burned. When he opened it, the torchlight flickered violently. Inside, wrapped in faded cloth, lay Harald's Bannertha, raven of Odin, its wings spread wide, its eyes staring as though it still saw the world. The fabric was soaked, torn, yet somehow it pulsed faintly in the firelight, as if alive. Ingrid stepped closer, her face pale. "The raven returns before the war ends," she murmured. "The sagas said so." Eirik lifted the banner slowly. The moment he did, the wind outside shifted, turning sharp and fast. The sea roared louder, and a strange hum filled the air, a low, vibrating tone that made his skin prickle. He looked at Ingrid. "He's calling us." She nodded once. "Then we answer." They carried the banner to the cliffs, raising it high against the storm. The fabric whipped violently in the wind, the raven's wings catching the lightning as if defying the heavens themselves. The thunder broke again, but this time, beneath it, there was another sound, a deep, rhythmic pulse. It took Eirik a moment to understand. Drums. From beyond the horizon. The people of the coast began to gather, drawn by the unexplainable pull of that sound. Old men who remembered Harald's wars. Women who had sung songs of his glory. Children who had only heard whispers. They stood in the rain, faces turned toward the sea. listening. The drums grew louder, closer, until the very air seemed to beat in time with them. And then they saw them shadows upon the water, moving through the mist. More ships! Dozens. Hundreds. Ghostly outlines gliding across the surface, their prows shaped like beasts, their sails black as the storm. No oars. No men. Just the echo of an army returning home. Eirik fell to his knees, the weight of it crushing his chest. He's come back, he breathed. He's brought them with him! Ingrid didn't move. Her face was streaked with rain and tears. No, she whispered. He never left. The ships came closer until they vanished in the crashing waves, dissolving into spray. But the thunder didn't fade. It grew, rising from the ground, from the mountains, from within the people themselves. The wind tore through the trees, howling like the cries of the slain. The storm reached its peak, and for one breathless instant, the world seemed to split open. Lightning struck the cliffs. The ground shook. The banner ripped free from Eirik's grasp and soared upward, its raven wings blazing white against the sky. The thunder answered with a roar so loud it silenced everything else. And then the rain stopped. The sea went still. Eirik looked up, heart hammering. The clouds parted, revealing the moon cold, white, and enormous. The banner had vanished, but in its place, a single raven circled high above, its cry echoing into the night. And in that moment, Eirik understood. The storm wasn't a curse. It was a call. A reminder that power never dies. Changes shape, finds new voices, new hearts to carry it. Harald Hardrada wasn't returning to reclaim his throne. He was becoming something else, something eternal. Ingrid's hand found his. Her grip was firm, steady. The age of kings is over, she said softly. Now begins the age of memory. But even as the storm began to drift away, leaving behind only mist and moonlight, a faint sound lingered on the air. The distant beat of drums fanned her now, but still there, hidden beneath the hush of the sea. Days passed. The wrecked ship disappeared beneath the tide, as if swallowed whole. The villagers returned to their lives, though none spoke of what they had seen. But at night, when the wind rose and the sea began to whisper, they swore they heard voices in the surfled songs carried from beyond the waves. Eirik and Ingrid left the coast soon after. They traveled inland, through forests where the fog hung low and silent. Every path seemed to lead them deeper into the land that once belonged to kings and now belonged to ghosts. They carried with them only a small piece of the Raven Banner, a torn fragment, still dark with seawater. One night, as they camped beside a frozen lake, Eirik dreamed. He stood once more on the field of Stamford Bridge, surrounded by the fallen. But this time, the air was quiet. No screams, no clashing steel, just the steady rhythm of wings. Harold stood before him not as a man, but as something vast and luminous, his eyes filled with the fire of stars. You carried my sword, Harold said, his voice like wind over mountains. Now carry my silence. Eirik tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. The king raised a hand, and the world around them began to fade, leaving only the sound of the raven's cry echoing across the void. When Eirik awoke, the fire had gone cold. The fragment of the banner lay in the ashes, glowing faintly as if lit from within. Ingrid stirred beside him, her eyes opening to the same sight. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. They knew what it meant. They buried the fragment beneath the roots of an old pine tree at dawn. The sun rose blood-red over the lake, turning the ice to molten gold. And as they watched, a single raven landed on a branch above them, tilting its head as if in farewell before taking flight into the morning light. Eirik exhaled slowly. He's gone, he said. Ingrid looked toward the sky, her voice barely a whisper. No, he's home. The wind stirred again, gentle this time, carrying with it the scent of salt and storm. For a heartbeat, it sounded like laughter, like the echo of a king who refused to fade into legend quietly. And as the land fell silent once more, Eirik understood what Harald Hardrada had truly left behind. Not an empire of earth and blood, but something far greater, an empire of remembrance, carved into the soul of every heart that still dared to dream of glory, even as the world turned to shadow. The storm had passed, but its memory would never die. The morning light spread across the fjord like a final benediction, soft and golden, touching the broken shields, the silent ships, and the faces of those who had survived. The echoes of the last battle still lingered in the air, though the sounds had faded. What remained now was silence, a vast, heavy silence filled with the weight of everything that had been lost and everything that had been proven. The ravens wheeled overhead, slow and deliberate, circling the aftermath as though reluctant to leave. Harold Hardrada stood on the blackened shore, his armor dented, his cloak torn, the edge of his sword still glinting faintly with the memory of blood. Around him, men moved like ghosts, not cheering, not mourning, just existing between exhaustion and disbelief. He had fought as though the gods themselves demanded it. Every strike, every roar, a defiance of age, of destiny, of the finality he had always known would come. But now, as the wind brushed across the water, he felt something different. Not defeat, not victory. Something quieter. Something like truth. The sea shimmered before him, endless and indifferent. The same sea that had carried him from Norway to Byzantium, from exile to empire, from youth to legend. He looked out at it as if it were a mirror reflecting his own life. Vast, unpredictable, and finally, still. The surviving warriors gathered, some lowering their heads, others staring at him, as though afraid that if they blinked, he would vanish like a dream. Harold turned toward them slowly. His voice, when it came, was low, but carried over the wind like a sermon. "The gods have tested us," he said, "and the world has changed. What we leave behind is not the land we conquer, but the courage we carried." His words were simple, stripped of the grandeur that had once defined him. For the first time, he spoke not as a king, but as a man who understood that power could not outlive time. He looked up at the hills where his banners still fluttered, torn and burned, yet somehow still holding against the wind. The sight stirred something deep inside him, pride, sorrow, and a strange peace. The years of ambition, the endless wars, the blood-spilled 4 crowns and kingdoms, they all seemed smaller now, shadows fading beneath the rising sun. He had wanted the world, and for a moment it had seemed within his grasp. But what he had truly earned was far greater, a name that would be spoken long after his bones had turned to dust. Behind him, a young warrior approached, hesitant. His armor was new, his hands still trembling from battle. "My king," he said softly, "was it worth it?" Harold did not answer immediately. His gaze stayed fixed on the horizon. "Ask me when the sea forgets the sound of oars," he finally said. "Ask me when the wind forgets the scent of fire." The young man nodded, not because he understood, but because the weight of those words seemed too sacred to question. As the day wore on, Harold walked alone through the remnants of what had been broken shields half buried in mud, swords abandoned like memories, the faint scent of iron and salt in the air. Each step felt heavier, not from pain, but from the slow realization that his journey, the journey of the last Viking, was nearing its end. He reached the crest of a hill overlooking the battlefield, and there, for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Below, the river glimmered, reflecting the sky like molten silver. The birds called softly in the distance, and the wind whispered through the grass. In that stillness, he remembered everything, the laughter of his men on long voyages, the cries of battle, the songs sung in great halls, under torchlight, the faces of those who had fallen beside him. He remembered his brother, Olaf, his queen, Elisef, and the strange calm in her eyes the day he left for England. He remembered the young version of himself, exiled and furious, vowing that one day he would carve his name into history. And he had. But the cost of such greatness, he now understood, was solitude. He sank to one knee, the weight of his armor groaning, and placed his sword into the earth. The steel caught the light and gleamed like a promise. "If the Norns have written my fate," he murmured, "then let it be known. I did not run from it." The wind answered in a long, low sigh. The sky darkened slightly, clouds drifting in from the west, and for a moment it felt as though the world itself was mourning. From the river below came the sound of oars, rhythmic, distant, ancient. The surviving ships were preparing to leave, their prows facing home. Harold rose slowly, his breath visible in the cooling air. He turned one last time toward the battlefield, as though taking in every scar, every silence. Then he walked toward the water. The men stepped aside as he passed, eyes following him, knowing instinctively that this was not a moment of command, but of farewell. When he reached the ship, he paused. His hand brushed the worn wood of the hull, the same kind of ship that had carried his ancestors into legend. He looked to the sky, the clouds shifting into streaks of gold and gray, and he smiled. Not the smile of victory or arrogance, but of acceptance. The sea always takes back its own, he whispered. The ship pushed away from the shore, its sail catching the dying light. The oars dipped into the water in slow unison, each stroke echoing like a heartbeat. Harold stood at the stern, unmoving, his gaze lost to the horizon. Around him, the world seemed to fade, the sound of the waves merging with memory, the light softening into something eternal. And in that fading, something beautiful happened. The legend of Harold Hardrada warrior, wanderer king, began to dissolve into myth. They said later that when the ship disappeared into the mist, the sun broke through the clouds and lit the fjord in a blaze of gold. Some swore they heard faint singing, old Norse verses carried on the wind, verses of courage and farewell. Others said they saw a single raven fly out across the water, following the ship until both vanished into the horizon. No one could prove it, but the story endured. Generations later, sailors spoke of a phantom longship that appeared in northern waters during storms, its sail glowing faintly beneath lightning, its captain standing proud at the helm. Some called it superstition, others a vision. Yet to those who believed, it was not a ghost, but a reminder that courage never truly dies. It simply changes form. In quiet moments, when the waves are calm and the night stretches long, the sea still whispers his name, the last Viking king, the man who sought the world and found eternity instead. And somewhere, between the clash of steel and the sigh of the tide, a question remains. What is it we truly conquer when all kingdoms fall to time? Is it the land beneath our feet, or the memory we leave in the hearts of those who follow? The wind carries no answer. Only the echo of oars fading into the distance, a rhythm older than history itself. Still beating, still alive, somewhere beyond the edge of the world.